Hello and welcome to The Conversation. My name is Shannon Taylor. I'm the Executive Director. The website is njbjc.org. And with me today, in honor of 9/11 and in honor of our organization's continuous salute to women, will be our women's program. I have Jeanette Saratsky and I have Sylvia McLean. Sylvia McLean is an arts administrator and public relations specialist and a community activist in Westchester, Greenwich, and Stanford. These are communities that we hope to extend ourselves to once again. Hence, I'm getting to know Ms. McLean as best I can. Sylvia is involved in issues, of course, with Israel, Jewish education, and fighting anti-Semitism, but in her long career as an educator and a programmer, she has fought racism of all forms. And she's dealt with children of all ages, students of all ages, and adults of all ages. Therefore, she graduates to our television program, which has I must say, a reach of all ages and forums. She's been an immediate past public relations officer for WFHA, and she'll tell you what that is. Of course, you need Irwin Corey to describe all the initials in today's relation world. And she has been throughout on media except ours. Ours is a new experience for her. And Jeanette, I wouldn't have to tell you how much experience she's had. I was just on a pilot for her own show. So she's quite comfortable in this kind of forum. Former Prime Minister Ehud Barak spoke in Greenwich, and Sylvia handled his public relations. That was hopefully before he started to hand back the rest of Lebanon in 2000, that she handled his public relations either after, before, had nothing to do with it, I trust. And then, of course, the Westchester Jewish Conference awarded her, finally, for all her tireless efforts, due recognition. And I want to now turn over the program, before we get to Sylvia, to Jeanette. Jeanette and I have known each other for the better part of a second generation, and Jeanette was the leader of New Jersey's second generation. We're both second generation survivors, and she's worked with Roman Kent, a survivor himself, and who was one of the leaders of the Warsaw Resistance Organizations and the Holocaust gatherings. And of course, Roman was one of the prime movers of those gatherings, and there was never a force to be seen in all of the Jewish world for gathering people who had never seen each other since the Holocaust. But before we do, just a few words about 9/11, from my own perspective. And 9/11 celebrated and memorialized and commemorated here in New York for our resistance to tyranny and to terrorism, with President Bush and Mayor Giuliani and Mayor Bloomberg and so on, Governor Pataki, of course, and all of the administrations in the world and Europe coming to grieve with us and mourn with us, still hasn't addressed the fundamental issues. First, when we were in Stuyvesant, before 9/11, we did a program on the Middle East, and we described fundamental Islamic Muslim tyranny and terrorism before 9/11 and why matters were not being handled with the precision and with the solemnity that it deserved. And the response was, what terrorism and what tyranny? And of course that school had to then be evacuated when it witnessed 9/11 hundreds of yards away from its doors, and was then used as a morgue for all the victims' bodies, reclamation, and identification. It was then precipitously again used for classes, and it then again had to be evacuated a year later for the auditorium to be renovated. When we did our programs with our usual alacrity, as soon as the initial reusage for classes began, I immediately said it is environmentally unsafe and unsound. I had said this in the first days after 9/11 when I was with the media and with all the public officials, with my own appropriate protection, but not enough protection, wondering where the rest were. Where were the EPA protections? Why weren't the guidelines enforced? And I didn't credit the numbers that were given as to safety. It was impossible. And as usual, all the environmentalists such as myself, there were plenty, were ignored. Just like for the previous 10 years, we had been ignored when we said these terrorists were coming back and the World Trade Towers were their target. We had said that for years before 9/11, and on 9/11 and in the months after, we warned and we cautioned that not enough protections were taken on an environmental basis, and not enough measures were taken to protect the workers, and not enough people were being sent home instead of put on half-time, quarter-time workforce. And the ramifications are being felt to this day because of expedition and because people were just not ready to face the true reach of the evil consequences of our enemy. With that said, I'm going to turn to Jeanette, who's known for being calm and pacific, taking things in stride.
Yeah, right.
And Jeanette, I offer it to you.
Well, first of all, let's see. I'm the editor-in-chief of a company called The Wordsmithy, and in that capacity I work with Roman Kent, who is the chairman of the American Gathering of Holocaust Survivors. I did a book with him called Strictly Business about his work, well, first his life in the ghetto, and then his life in Auschwitz, and then his life in America, which is extremely interesting because he started his business out of the trunk of his car selling housewares to sharecroppers around Atlanta and ended up on the Home Shopping Network. And he's also the vice president of the Foundation for Righteous Gentiles, the Jewish Foundation for Righteous Gentiles, and they help people in Europe who are poor who help save Jewish lives. That's one. Two, as far as 9/11 is concerned, 9/11 is a really serious problem in the sense that, yes, we did ignore all the warnings about Islamofascism. I remember seeing Daniel Pipes at a meeting about 15 years ago. I heard what he said. I couldn't believe what he was saying could be true, but 9/11 proved that with Daniel Pipes and people like Stephen Emerson, who keep their fingers on the pulse of what's going on in the real world, they predicted all of it. I know Bill Clinton tried to do something about Osama bin Laden and wasn't able to because every time he tried, the Republican Congress accused him of trying to distract the world from Monica, and now they're saying Monica distracted him from the world, so Bill Clinton can never win, even when he hasn't been president for almost 8 years. And the results of the environmental hazards that were created on 9/11, and I realized that there was a serious problem because I kept saying, where are the bodies? Because a lot of my friends went down to St. Vincent's to work, and there was nobody coming. And I realized that a lot of the stuff that people were inhaling were the kinds of things that our parents inhaled in Auschwitz and in Bergen-Belsen and in other places. In other
Well, I can
words,
tell you that I wanted to go down in Elbow too, and my husband, who's an architect, said, please don't go, because he understood what was happening when those towers came down. We didn't go to that area for a year, you know, not because our hearts weren't ripped out, but because of health reasons. And now we see that that was the right action to take.
well, you know, it's really scary when you had friends who lived downtown and now they have breathing problems.
Absolutely.
And it's really serious when people are told that there's nothing wrong with them and there is something wrong with them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is the same kind of thing that the government did to the Gulf War veterans, and it also did the same thing to the Vietnam veterans on Agent Orange. I mean, we really need to look at what our government is doing when it says that there's no global warming, or there are no particulates in the atmosphere that can hurt you, or things that we should not take for granted. We should always make sure that we're not being lied to.
But I can tell you, in defense of the government, they claim that they didn't have that problem at the Pentagon because whoever was controlling whatever repair was going on at the Pentagon did not let any of the workmen onto the site unless they were wearing the proper respiratory equipment. And somehow in New York, it just got really out of hand.
Let me join in here and ask this question. There's been a lot of debate now that the numbers were fudged, that the environmental questions that were asked at the time were met with misrepresentations. Some were careless, some were hurried, but the most important ones allegedly were deliberately fudged.
Well,
The interests were supposedly to rebuild the city as quick as possible, to maintain order and stability as quick as possible, to retain confidence, and to put New York back on its feet and to show the world that we're still here. It's almost like the frontier kind of mentality, like the West is one or something like that. It's not my type of philosophy, so I can't phrase it the way it would best be phrased.
you mean cowboy mentality?
No, I wouldn't put it that way. It's more like we're in a war, and in the war we have to sacrifice our environmental health in order to gain a higher
You mean-
priority.
What you mean 3,000 dead people wasn't enough? I mean, what you're saying here, Shannon, is that the numbers were fudged in order to make people more victims? I don't know. I think that the numbers were fudged because I don't think people knew what they were doing. I think that people didn't realize that most of what they were looking at were human remains.
Yes, and I agree with you 100%. One aspect that we really have to consider is the psychological response of all of us, and especially the people who came down to work on the pile, as they call it. Everybody seemed to have both good intentions and absolute fear. They wanted to get to the bottom of it. They wanted to clear it away. That's on a psychological, on an emotional level. So when you mix all that together, what you're talking about, fudging figures and this kind of mentality, it really is a very difficult issue.
Let me pose this question. There's a coal mine. And it's not the coal mine of the 1880s where people who owned the mines didn't care who came out alive. We're talking about today where you have leadership, people who stand for leadership say, if you're going to do this job and put us back on our footing, we want you standing tomorrow, so you must wear this equipment in order to get the job done safely for yourself and quickly. You must wear it, or we're sorry, it can't be done. That's the answer to those who say no one would have worn it, put it on, considered it necessary. Do you agree that that leadership should have been there and was lacking on all fronts?
Oh, I agree.
I
It was
agree with
really
that.
failing.
I agree with
A
that.
real failure in that area.
I agree with that, but I also think, knowing not many, but a few police officers in the city of New York, and having known some firemen in the city of New York, that putting that equipment on, they would have felt that they were being hindered. And the second thing is that they were driven, and they would not have waited for the uniforms to come through, and they would not have waited for the regulations to be done. A lot of these people would have simply just gone in there with their bare hands and ripped the place apart to get at the people that they needed to help. I think that a lot of that in the first couple of hours, when
Absolutely.
was definitely
Yeah.
definitely what was on people's minds. It wasn't that they were inhaling what they were inhaling. I think that came a few weeks later when they began to realize, wait a minute, what is it that we are inhaling?
Right.
And what is in all of this white dust? And, because now they're still finding remains on top of buildings downtown. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's just unbelievable. I watched it from the other side of the river. I took myself over to Jersey City, and I said Kaddish on the smoke. And I said, this is one day in Auschwitz. I said, this is what it felt like to be in that place, maybe a little bit, and not even hardly. I mean, because you can't imagine, that every day in Auschwitz was just like one day at the World Trade Center. But yeah. And when Shannon says that we're second generation, what he means is that we're children of Holocaust survivors. And that shapes our philosophy, and it shapes the way we think, and it shapes the way we act in public and the way we make political decisions, because we feel that we're not allowed to sit on our hands, that we have a legacy, that we have a reason for being, and part of that is an obligation to be public people and make public statements and pursue policies that make the world a better place. We know what evil is, and we're not going to tolerate it, and that's it.
And not being a Holocaust survivor, I can really appreciate it and add another note to what you're saying. Anybody who went through the Holocaust really went through the fire. You come through that kind of a fire, emotionally, physically, whatever, you're entitled to do what you feel you must do, So,
here's something for the survivor of the families. I've met a couple of WTC survivors. Some of them happen to be children of Holocaust survivors as well, which is like a double whammy on their heads psychologically. I'd like to tell some of the families that, it's hard to believe, but one of the lessons that we learn from the survivors is that life goes on. And not only does life go on, I mean, these people have lost hundreds of extended family members in one shot. I know one woman who had 10 brothers and sisters, all gone in one shot. Stories like that abound, and yet these people, when they came through that fire and realized that life had to go on, they also understood that life had to be a good life, and they rebuilt families from nothing. They were the Adam and Eves coming to America, going to France, going to Israel, going to wherever they went. Some started in Morocco, some started in Tehran. Wherever they started to rebuild their lives, they rebuilt their lives, and they made them good lives, and they made them ethical lives for the most part. And that's something that the survivors of the W Trade Center families, the families of those who didn't make it through in the survivor families, should understand that. I think it's an important lesson.
I think that they do, and I can see by their activism that whether they realize that they're emulating second generation or whatever from the Holocaust, they are being very vocal, and which is adding to the time it's going to take to rebuild the site, but they certainly have a right to do that.
Let me join in. You see, our program is called The Conversation, and when we put people together on these issues, the conversation springs forth naturally. The two of you were never discussing this before, but it's just a natural springboard. Sylvia was even wondering what questions I would ask, and I advise her that we never say in advance what's going to come up. It comes up because it's the conversation. And we're talking with Sylvia McLean and with Jeanette Saratsky. Jeanette, I know for quite some time, but for generations. And Sylvia was introduced to me by Jeanette, and I thought it was only natural that we all come together here. And I want to turn now a little bit to Sylvia. Tell me about your education with children in Westchester. Away from the gloomy scene we have here, we know about Osama and Al-Qaeda and all of his minions, and one by one this wonderful administration is knocking them out, and one by one our wonderful soldiers are doing their great job here and in Israel. So Sylvia, tell us about the next generation of kids coming up.
Okay, I had a wonderful thing happen to me about a decade ago. I read in the paper that a group of parents were getting together to build a school because there was not enough room in the day school in our area. namely White Plains and Mamaroneck. And having been very active when my daughter was in a day school and she was all grown, my husband and I decided to join this group of people, and the rest became history. I have a background in arts administration, knew how to build a school, you know, as far as administratively and fundraising and publicity and all that kind of stuff. So it ended up that there's 16 founders of this school called Westchester Fairfield Hebrew Academy, which just a few months ago had its first graduation from the 8th grade. It goes from kindergarten through the 8th grade, and it's a community day school. In other words, people from all Jewish denominations are invited to bring their children and be part of this. So the school started in Westchester, and as it grew, it ended up being in Greenwich, which is why the name is Westchester Fairfield, Fairfield County. And just a few weeks ago, we closed on a property which I believe is about 16 acres, and it's the former home of the Choate School, Rosemary Hall. Beautiful, beautiful site. And we have 130 children there, 2 kindergarten classes, and the classes go through the 8th grade. We're associated with Israel. That's where a lot of our teachers get training at the Shalom Hartman Institute. So, and what we do there, the kind of teaching we do, it has an integrated curriculum. So if you're learning about Thanksgiving, you're learning about Sukkot. And what we do with that is there's a program called Eitz Chaim, which teaches children on the basis of ethics. All the ethics from the Torah are taken as the foundation of what the children learn in school, and they learn from original texts, and they go through everything that children do in any other good day school. However, with this ethical base, you end up with a different kind of a product in your child. And now in the 8th grade, last year was the first time, the children go off to Israel because they're studying Jewish history, which ends with the modern period in Israel. And they get there in time for Yom HaAtzmaut, Yom HaShoah, and
What are these holidays?
Yom HaAtzmaut is the celebration of the birthday of Israel, and Yom HaShoah is a commemoration each year of just what Jeanette was talking about, commemorating all the horrors that people went through in the
But we
Holocaust.
also remember resistance. I mean, it's very important. One of the problems, you know, you're talking about Yom HaShoah, and you're talking about these kids getting educated so
yeah.
wonderfully with ethics. Thank God, ethics, yes. And one of the problems that we've discovered in our 25 years of trying to teach the Holocaust and working with people is that the 6 million dead Jews are a Jewish problem. And the rest of the world is not really interested in hearing about it. But what they need to hear about it is not about the 6 million dead Jews. What they need to know is that an event took place, and it doesn't matter who the victims are, but the victims were the victims because they were hated, and there was a system that was instituted to kill these victims.
That's right.
And that system needed to get blown apart, which it did. And the lesson from that is
Right.
that you
mean
can't
the
hate.
fascists, the Nazis.
Right.
Yeah. Well, it's more than that. It's more than that. It was also, you know, the church is doing tshuva. The Catholic Church in Rome, the last 2 popes, this pope and the pope before particularly, are extending themselves very, very, very far out to the Jewish community. This pope was exorcised for what he said or didn't say in Auschwitz. It was such a wrong approach to take because they only looked at that one little thing in a vacuum, and they didn't realize that he had written extensively on the Holocaust, and he had his whole papal encyclical and his biblical statement and all kinds of things that the Pope does. That was all very pro-Jewish, all coming out of the fact that there had been a Holocaust and that a lot of the reason for it had come from the church itself.
Right.
So, they took one thing and they twisted it. All right.
Well,
Well,
I
we're not going to go back to
I
the-
wouldn't limit it to the church by any means. If you go into German history, if you go back to the Wagnerian type of demagoguery that's in the ring, if you go,
Yeah, but that
if
isn't
you
Christian
go,
church.
If you go to Islamic history and leave the church out, if you go, the Mufti met with Hitler as best brothers, and there
Well, yeah.
was no Israel at the time. You
It
don't
wouldn't have
need
made a
church-
difference, honey. Israel, no Israel. They were already there. They were pulling people out of Cyprus. They were pulling people out of Damascus. If he wouldn't have been stopped in northern Africa, you think the Jews in Tel Aviv wouldn't have gone to
No, but
Auschwitz?
you didn't need the church. There was a universal
Right.
quotient of the Jew as a universal enemy.
Because of the mentality going all the way back to the 1st century and Caesar, who needed to take power when the church was being born, and it's so complicated, and it's so heavy-duty, and people don't want to know, and people say, oh, that's too esoteric, and it happened too long ago, but it was all built in. And the church says it was all built in, and they say they're sorry they built it in, and now they're unbuilding that.
Right. And even
And
if you
you know,
don't,
9/11, there are people who say 9/11 came about in New York because the Jews, and then they say, well, there were no Jewish victims, and when you answer it,
Oh,
of
well,
course there were
yeah.
Jewish victims, and there were plenty of Israeli victims. They say, oh, we didn't know that, and then they say, well, who told you they were coming back to attack the World Trade Center? Were they Jews? No. And who said they can't wait to wipe out the West? Were they Jews? No. And where did they all come from? Saudi Arabia or Israel? And no matter what you say, and no matter what the facts, when they still want to blame the Jews, there is only one answer for this hatred. And it has nothing to do with church, it has one answer for this hatred. They want to blame the Jews, period.
Well, that's because Jews have been victims for 2,500
Because
years.
they like
and
to
the
be
problem,
victims.
and the
They
problem,
ask to be victims.
the
and they
problem with the state of Israel is
Why would you say
that for a lot of people, the problem is that the state of Israel exists. It's not allowed to exist. Because if it exists, then Jews can't be victims anymore. And if Jews can't be victims anymore, then that's not a good thing. Now, I'm fully aware of this because I had a guy come to my house today to attach a fiber optic cable, and he opened up his mouth, and I got an earful, and I threw him out of my house.
I told you that's got nothing to do with this show, your fiber optic cable. Leave me alone with your fiber optic.
It's not the fiber optic cable, it's the fiber optic cable
We
guy.
got 20 seconds left, Jeanette. I'm going to give you and Sylvia the last words, because I wouldn't get a word in edgewise anyway. So 20 seconds. It's been a
Shannon,
delight
thank
having
you
on.
for having us on the show. We really appreciate being here. It's a lot of fun. I never use Saratsky. It's my married name. I use Friedman, but that's okay.
I thought it was the opposite.
No, I use my maiden name.
and Shannon, I thank you also for having me on the show, and to have end it on a hopeful note. If anyone is interested in knowing more about the Westchester Fairfield Hebrew Academy, they can look at their website, www.wfha.org. And Shep Nachas, as we say in Yiddish, which means get loads and loads of pleasure to see what's coming in the future.
Thank you both.